A-Level Economics Paper 1 is tomorrow. Do you want an A-star? Of course you do. Then watch this video. I am going to be giving you some tips that'll help you revise the most important things today, review them, make sure you're confident on as many topics as you possibly can be, so that you are then able to walk into the exam tomorrow and do your best performance in economics ever. I'm also going to be giving you some tips and methods to use in the exam, essay structure, how to approach multiple choice questions. That will hopefully really help. Today is the day before. The day before is a wonderful opportunity to make sure that you have all of the key ideas fresh in your head. And the most important things for me when it comes to economics are to make sure that you have nailed the diagrams, that you have enough contemporary context to be able to draw on in your essay responses, and that you have got keyword definitions down to a T. Those are sort of the most fundamental things that you can be looking at the day before. In terms of processes and these wider concepts, if you know that there are certain areas that you just are not amazing at, please tell me that you're going to watch some Econ Plus DAO videos today, because they will help you to just get that extra bits of context, to fill in those gaps, to make sure that if there is a question regarding that bit of content, particularly if it's a multiple choice question, you're still able to tackle it. Obviously, if it's an essay question, you might choose not to answer it if you know that that is not your strong point. So today is not the day to make sure all of the topics are on a level playing field, because that's not necessarily ever going to happen. It is the day to make sure that you're going to be able to pick up as many marks as you possibly can, and that means focusing on those areas that are sort of definitely going to come up. And that is diagrams, keywords, and contemporary context. So for diagrams, what I would do is I would just take out some sort of whiteboard, some sort of notebook, whatever you have, and I would try and, from memory, draw as many paper 1 diagrams as you possibly can. Just from memory. This is testing, not only do you know the diagrams, but it's also testing, do you actually know what is going to be assessed on this paper? So if you're thinking through in your head all of the different topics that come up on this paper, you should be able to think the vast majority of the diagrams that are related to those topics. Then what you're going to do, go online. There are so many compilations of all the diagrams relevant to paper 1 to paper 2. Look at the ones relevant to paper 1, have a look, compare to yours. Did you get the diagrams that you drew right? That is crucial. Don't just look for whether or not you included them. Do make sure that the ones you did draw were correct, where your axes labelled correctly, where your curves labelled correctly. Make sure that you also, on top of being able to draw it, actually understand the implications of it. So what would cause shifts in the curve? How would you actually show that? What is the outcome on equilibrium, or whatever it is? Then, from your diagrams, obviously add in those ones that you didn't understand, or the ones that you missed off. I would most definitely put onto a cheat sheet so that you can look over it right before you go into an exam tomorrow to make sure they're all very fresh in your minds. So that's for the diagrams. For keywords, for key definitions, I want you to find a list. So many online. Just search up, economics, A-level, whatever your exam board is, paper 1, keywords. And you'll more than likely be able to find a PDF, keywords and their definitions. Don't look at the definitions. Just look at the keywords and make sure you can define them all. Obviously, it doesn't need to be word for word definition, but it needs to include the key points, the key ideas of that definition. Now, if there are words that you can't define or that you get miserably wrong, also add those to your cheat sheet, because this cheat sheet is going to be amazing, because it's going to make sure that just before you walk into the exam, everything that you didn't know today, the day before the exam, is going to be fresh in your short-term memory, so you'd still be able to apply it in the exam. So thinking more about context. It is really important that you understand the global economic context and the domestic economic context. And in order to show an examiner that you are able to do that, you want to be bringing in contemporary examples. Now, the general rule of thumb is, yes, it's very important for you to know about things like the 2008 financial crisis. It's important for you to know about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and, for example, the disaster of Trussonomics. Those are all really useful. But generally you want to be thinking about things that have happened in the past 6 months to 2 years ago, which Trussonomics sort of falls into. So I'd keep that in the forefront of your mind. But other things that have happened in this gap, which is the general gap that, an exam will pick up on certain key economic events to talk about, are the 2024 March budget, where fuel duty was frozen and there was an increase in windfall tax on oil and gas giants. Those are some very interesting things to talk about in terms of government intervention, in terms of taxes, in terms of subsidy. You might have noticed an increase in Aldi price matching across supermarkets. So Tesco, Sainsbury's, they all have this Aldi price match. And that is very indicative of competition between different firms. And it's quite an interesting example given that it's in the food market. We've got necessity goods and obviously luxury goods in there as well. But the majority of foodstuffs are going to be necessity goods. So this is a very interesting market for you to be looking at. You could be thinking about negative externalities and government intervention to reduce or overcome those negative externalities. So think about the ULEZ project in London and how that has been there's been quite a lot of backlash against ULEZ, and it's very interesting to see how that is an intervention which is supposedly going to be increasing people's welfare, but people have a lot of resistance against it. So you can have a little look at the friction that policymakers face as they're trying to reduce externalities. As ever, rising private rents in cities like London and Manchester it's a perennial problem that can come up a lot in exam papers because there's a lot that you can discuss in terms of rental markets. You can be discussing government interventions, price caps, what can we actually do to make housing more affordable. Are you going to look at the supply side or are you going to look at the demand side? So that is a very interesting one as well. Obviously, there are broader things, the war in Ukraine, for example, and the impact of that on oil prices, on food prices. That is a massive disrupting conflict that could be the focus of a question, as is the potential for trade wars, but that is obviously going to be more of a paper 2 topic. And finally, another context that could be really interesting to be tested on is government investment in green projects. So green subsidies, obviously in the US they have bigger things like the CHIPS Act, the Green New Deal, but in the UK there's been a large focus on domestic investment in renewable technologies, in life sciences, and thinking about how we can make the economy more sustainable, and that could lead to a broader discussion of whether GDP, for example, is a good context and a good indicator of economic development, or whether we need to be looking at people, their resources, their capabilities instead. Okay, that's context. Let's think a bit more about the exam itself. You're going to have section A, you're going to have some multiple choice questions. Now, multiple choice questions, I'm going to run through exactly what you should be doing. I have another much longer video talking about multiple choice question strategies, but what we're going to do is you're going to have a look at the answers, read the question 2 times, and then have a look at the answers. Read through every single one of those options before you choose one, because too many students will just read through, see, oh, B looks right, and not read C and D. Always read all of them. And then, okay, think to yourself, can you eliminate any of them straight away, or any of them just clearly wrong? Do that. Then have a think, okay, am I looking at a definition? Do I remember what the key things related to that keyword are? Do I need to be thinking about how diagrams are shifting? In which case, if you're thinking about diagrams and your options are diagrams, draw out the diagram yourself. Think about the process, talk yourself through it, because it can be quite hard to look at the diagrams completed and work backwards and think, okay, what happened to make it go there? Do the whole process yourself, and that'll help you come to the diagram a lot more easily. However, these are multiple choice questions. Do not spend too long on them, because your marginal gains are going to be significantly higher from spending your time on an essay than they are from spending time on a multiple choice question that you're genuinely stuck on, in which case try and eliminate as many as you can and then guess. Also read very, very carefully, because a lot of these questions are going to be application based. You need to have an understanding of the causal mechanisms, the chains of reasoning, as it were, that kind of occur in the economy when a certain difference, when interest rates rise or when governments increase spending, something like that. You need to be understanding that these are application based. They're not generally just asking you for definitions. Now, always check units if it's a mathematical based question, and make sure you do know the key equations, the key identities that are going to give you price elasticity and cross elasticity, those sorts of things. Section B, this is data response. They're looking for a clear understanding of the theory, really good and informative diagrams, and an ability to apply your knowledge to a certain context. So I want you to be really specific in this. I want you to be tying back to the data, tying back to the extracts as much as you possibly can. I want you to be underlining key ideas. You'll be given your exam paper, and in that you can be highlighting, you can be underlining, just don't use highlighters on your actual responses. Just make sure you're trying to make things as focused as possible. In a 10 marker, don't spend too much time on this, but you want to have a couple of really developed points and a really clear thesis that you keep going back to. A lot of people forget on their 15 markers that diagrams are absolutely key. You want to be putting them in, you want to be explaining them as fully and comprehensively as you possibly can, and you really, really, really want to be linking back to the extracts. Do not neglect the extracts at any point. Section C, this is your 25 mark essay. This is the most important section because this is going to make or break your grade. You really need to focus in it. And because it is so important, you want to spend a solid 3 to 5 minutes planning. Plan exactly what your paragraphs are going to be. Now, personally, I know that there are a lot of tips out there that are okay, put at one point another point, and then an evaluation paragraph. I would sort of do one point and evaluate that point, another point and evaluate that point. I felt that made a lot more sense to me. So if you've been taught in a certain way, but you sort of write that way and you don't feel like it's natural, write in the way that it feels the most natural to you, but making sure that you're getting in the points, the theory, the diagrams, the content, and the analysis. And always, as often as you can, link to some context. Show the examiner that you understand that the principles you are discussing are not just arbitrary. They don't just exist in the theoretical world of economics, they exist in the real world. And the only way you're going to be able to show that is if you can give an example of that happening in the real world. And that is where you go back to all of those contexts that I talked about earlier on in the video. Whatever you do, don't sit on the fence. Even if you personally are sat on the fence, it is really hard to craft a convincing argument and a convincing essay if your conclusion is, oh, but it doesn't really matter because I don't really know. Because that is how it generally comes across if you're sat on the fence. Pick a side and write your conclusion to match that side. What I would always do is I would state my conclusion, as it were, my opinion, at the end of my introduction paragraph, so that as I was writing the rest of the essay, I was guided by that perspective. And that meant that I was obviously able to evaluate the other side of the argument, but that I wasn't deviating, that my essay was coherent. And having a coherent essay with coherent points that all relate back to your thesis is what will make you stand out as someone who's actually given a considered response, rather than just, writing down all of the definitions and putting in diagrams and trying to brain dump everything, because the exam is not the time for brain dumping. In the introduction of an essay, always define your key terms. You get a little extra marks for defining your key terms. That is really useful. Make sure that you are labeling your diagrams fully, comprehensively. Use arrows to show shifts. Just make it really, really clear, because the examiner is not inside your head. They don't understand what you're using your diagram for unless you label it properly, you explain it properly in your writing, and it is clear. Don't be afraid to make your diagrams absolutely massive. My economics teacher always went on about making your diagrams like half a page large. I didn't do them quite that big, but still they need to be large enough for them to show up clearly when they are scanned in. So those are my tips for A-Level Economics, paper 1. Good luck. Let me know in the comments how it goes and if you want me to focus on anything specific for economics paper 2.